It's very much part of a wider Ukrainian campaign to go after people who have actively been supporting the Russian invasion and the Russian occupation effort, to more or less say it doesn't matter if you're, a top-level politician or even just some sort of just middle-ranking official, you're still vulnerable. This is the second time that they, or at least someone, has tried to go after this militia commander. I mean, essentially, it's clear that there was a bomb placed under his 4x4, and then at a suitable moment it was detonated and he was killed. And the interesting thing is, look, I mean, on one level, this guy is not that important. I mean, he was always just simply a small cog in the Russian occupation machine. But it's very much part of a wider Ukrainian campaign to go after people who have actively been supporting the Russian invasion and the Russian occupation effort, to more or less say it doesn't matter if you're, a top-level politician or even just some sort of just middle-ranking official, you're still vulnerable. So you might want to think twice as to whether or not you want to work for Moscow or not.
And what is the merit, what is the impact of doing this? What benefit or impact does it have?
Well, look, the Ukrainian thinking is at the moment, in some ways, the war is too comfortable for terrible if you happen to be one of those mobilized reservists currently sitting shivering in a muddy trench somewhere in southern Ukraine. But actually, this is not something that has really sort of impacted Russian society as a whole, especially when there's not mobilization campaigns. So the idea is essentially to reach out, and by a whole series of sabotage attacks, some on military targets, some not, hitting propagandists and derailing trains and just generally making ordinary Russians feel that the war is a threat to them. Now, again, the problem is that there are a lot of people in the West who actually worry that this could be counterproductive and that, in fact, Russians will just get more bloody-minded. They'll be more likely to think, well, actually, maybe Putin has a point and we need to teach these Ukrainians a lesson. But certainly at present, that's essentially Kyiv's strategy, to bring the war to ordinary Russians too.
What you say there about the relationship, Mark, between sort of US and UK security services and Ukraine's and Kyiv's security services then, what else should we understand about that sort of relationship and how much of that expression of concern from Western intelligence agencies is simply a sort of PR thing? It's about kind of trying to calm any potential tensions.
Well, there's always going to be an element of PR, and especially when we start seeing stories, particularly like recent ones in the American press with all these sort of anonymous sources, it looks pretty clear that, in fact, the government had sort of given the go-ahead for them to actually go and speak to journalists. So, yes, there's an element of PR, absolutely. But I mean, the key things to understand is, first of all, actually just how deep and important this relationship is. I mean, it goes back to really in 2014, when the Russians annexed Crimea. Really, since then, especially the British and American intelligence services have been helping their Ukrainian counterparts. And it's worth noting, actually, that just as Britain has been punching above its weight in terms of military assistance, the same is also true of intelligence assistance. I mean, given that the American intelligence apparatus is just so massively bigger than the Brits, nonetheless, proportionate to size, actually, Britain has a greater role in Ukraine than even the Americans. And it's something that actually a lot of Ukrainians are very happy to recognize. So there's this long, useful relationship, and it's a two-way one, because the Ukrainians have their own sources and their own insights, which they feed back to us. So there's a lot that's positive there. But particularly of late, we're beginning to see a little bit of tension, not just because of a sense that the Ukrainian strategy might be a little bit counterproductive, but also out of a fear that the Russians are going to misread this. Remember, as far as Moscow is concerned, Ukraine is just basically a puppet of the Americans and, yes, us, the Brits. They always talk about the Anglo-Saxons as the sort of the great demon. And in that respect, if the Ukrainians are carrying out assassinations and sabotage inside Russia, there is a concern that Moscow might regard this as essentially a proxy war being fought by us, and that we are somehow telling Kyiv, go out and murder some Russians. And that therefore the Russians might well begin to step up their operations in Europe, in Britain and in America. Because up to now, what's interesting is that a regime which has been happy to poison and generally murder and suppress people abroad for years has actually been rather more cautious inside NATO since the start of the war. And so there is this fear that that caution might evaporate.
the other interesting part of all of this, Mark, as you discuss in your article in the Sunday Times today, is from one retired Ukrainian intelligence officer who says countries that kill their enemies on the other side of the world with drones can hardly complain about our methods. This is a fight for Ukraine's survival. Our allies shouldn't try to tie our hands or look over our shoulders. And that's interesting, perhaps, in terms of the tension that could sort of rise up between the UK, the US, and Ukraine on these sorts of strategic issues.
Absolutely. And look, when I was writing this piece and obviously reaching out to various contacts of mine on every side, one of the things that really had come out when talking to Ukrainians was actually a degree of irritation. It was basically, look, this is us with our backs to the wall. Of course, we're not going to hold back. We are going to use whatever we have at our disposal. And look, on a purely emotional level, I can totally understand that. I mean, and let's be honest, the criticisms is not because, oh, no, you ought to be kinder to the Russians. No, the critiques that I've been hearing from the Western side is just simply that it might be counterproductive. But it does show something about the tensions that are always there. On the one hand, clearly in the West, we want Ukraine to win and to win quickly. But on the other hand, we also have slightly different perspectives than the Ukrainians. And from time to time, it will manifest itself in this ways. But I should really stress that I don't think anyone is talking about, for example, ending or reducing the intelligence cooperation, especially because it's very useful for us as well. It's just simply, clearly demonstrating that we shouldn't assume that there aren't tensions in this relationship.
Yeah. What about, Mark, one of your other remarks in your article is around Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister's comments, sort of based on Ukraine fatigue, a degree of Ukraine fatigue settling in, I guess. I don't want to ask this in a way that sounds trite, trivial, or flippant. Does Ukraine need to inspire people out of a sense of fatigue? Is it for Ukraine to do that, or actually is it for ourselves to keep shaking ourselves into the realization that this war is ongoing and Ukraine needs backing?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's everyone's task. I mean, if one thinks of President Zelensky of Ukraine, he has been an astonishing, and again, I don't want to trivialize the role, but cheerleader for Ukraine. I mean, he has proven himself to be an amazing communicator, and also has, again, I don't mean this negatively because this is his job, played the West very well in terms of making sure that he gets a lot of assistance. And, billions of pounds, dollars, and euros are flowing to Ukraine every month. And yes, I think now we're at a point where, as it becomes clear that this war is not going to end soon, and I was talking to some military analysts last week within the MOD and elsewhere, who are actually talking now about, well, what might be happening in the war in 2025. So it gives us a sense of just how long a time frame. In that context, we've got to move beyond the simple moral outrage. What is happening to Ukraine is, of course, absolutely wrong. But I think just simply when we see other stories like what's happening in Gaza beginning to sort of take over the media attention, we have to move beyond just simply, oh my gosh, it's wrong, poor Ukraine needs to be helped, and really begin to articulate some kind of clear understanding of why it is actually in our pragmatic and practical interests to be helping Ukraine. That's, I think, the area of the debate that hasn't yet really come out, whether either from the Ukrainians or, frankly, from our own politicians.